there. If your horse grabs the fence, grabs surfaces like stalls, buckets, fences, the inside of the indoor arena, and then starts to make that weird grunting noise, I'm going to say something to you that not many horse people will say to you. Your horse is not being naughty. I know, music to your ears. And people who just slap a collar on their horse and say, job done, problem solved, you might actually be making the situation worse without realizing it. Today, I'm going to talk about the infamous behavior cribbing, also known as wind sucking. Let's talk about why horses do this, what it does to their body, and what actually helps to prevent this behavior in the first place. Let's start with the basics. What is cribbing? Cribbing is when a horse takes their incisors and they latch onto a surface, usually a wooden surface, and they arch their neck, pull back, and they rapidly suck in air. I know it sounds pretty bizarre. Some people have horses that crib, they don't even realize what their horse is actually doing. They think they're just wood chewing. This is not wood chewing. When a horse cribs, this is considered a stereotypic behavior. That just means the behavior is repetitive and usually formed in response to a stressful situation or a stressful environment. It can also be in response to restriction. So it's not random behavior, it's not attention seeking, it's not a learned behavior, but it is a coping mechanism. A coping mechanism? Coping mechanism for what? Well, usually confinement being number one cause of cribbing. The horse naturally was designed to roam anywhere from 15 up to as many as 30 miles a day. So when you put that same horse in a 12 by 12 stall, or even smaller, I've seen 10 by 10, and they're in that stall, that confined space, for hours a day, their brain is gonna need an outlet. And that outlet just might so happen to be your actual outlets, your stalls, your walls, your fences. So it's not good for the horse or you. It's in everybody's best interest to address this issue. Your horse can also start cribbing as a response to having a lack of access to forage, like horses being in stalls. I know a lot of people will put a hay net in their horse's stall so they have something to munch on, which is fantastic. But sometimes they go through that hay and then they don't have anything to actually chew on. Bear in mind, a horse's stomach is producing stomach acid constantly, not just when they're eating. And when they don't have anything in the stomach to buffer the stomach acid, that stomach acid just builds and builds. I did just make a video about gastric ulcers in horses that goes into a little more detail than I'm going to go in this video. So I'll put a link in the description if you're interested. So when that acid just builds and builds, you'll get gastric irritation, potentially even leading to ulcers if it's prolonged, and of course, stress behaviors. When horses get weaned too early, that can also trigger them to cope by cribbing. High grain diets are also associated with cribbing because high grain diets are harder for the horse to digest. It's not what they're made to digest. It's pretty foreign to them in the grand scheme of things. So to cope with stomach pain, you guessed it, cribbing. Horses will also crib to cope with a lack of social contact with other horses. It's not good enough to put a horse in a pasture by itself next to a horse in a separate pasture. Horses need to be able to fully interact with each other, not just sniff at each other over a fence line. There's also stalls out there that have a full wall of wood in between the horse's stalls. There's not a window or a partition for them where they can at least see another horse. They're literally isolated, kind of in like a jail cell. I know it sounds a little extreme, but when you're a horse and you are in a small enclosed space with no access to other horses, that's exactly what it is. For that reason, if you can, if you're like building a barn and if it's in your budget, I would highly recommend getting a stall where you have the partition in the middle so the horses can see each other, or building stalls across from that stall so that your horse can see each other. I know it's not practical for breeding facilities or horses with behavior issues, but generally speaking, this is good practice because isolation creates coping behaviors. Cribbing is actually not the root problem, it's just a symptom of a much bigger problem. We talked about how it's a coping mechanism. So, what exactly is going on in the brain when the horse is cribbing? Cribbing releases endorphins and dopamine in the horse's brain. It literally makes your horse feel better and it becomes self rewarding. The horse has discovered a behavior that they can do repeatedly for reliable positive influx of chemicals. It provides temporary relief, very temporary, which is why it's such a destructive coping mechanism because the horse repeatedly chews on the same piece of wood. It becomes a behavior that your horse isn't even aware it's doing. It just does it on impulse. It becomes a habit. And this is why collars don't fix it. Cribbing collars don't actually prevent the horse from cribbing. They make it more difficult and uncomfortable for it to engage in that behavior. Let me briefly explain the problem with cribbing collars. So, the horse, in order to suck in air, it has to bite down on something, arch its neck. The cribbing collar impedes arching of the neck, and it has to be able to pull back and suck in air. The cribbing collar just makes it very uncomfortable for your horse to properly arch its neck, properly pull back, and properly suck in air. Some horses will still get around this if they're that determined, and it can cause sores, even scarring in severe cases. So, cribbing collars, even best case scenario, they don't solve the problem. They just make it very hard for your horse to do that behavior. And guess what? As soon as that cribbing collar is removed, your horse is back at that same behavior. Your horse immediately starts cribbing again. And of course, the cribbing collars, like I said, they cause soreness, rubs, muscle strain. They're very easy to be fitted incorrectly. There's a lot of room for error, and it's not addressing the root cause, so I hate cribbing collars. I am not a fan. It's just a mechanical deterrent, not a cure. I know some people say, well, you know what? What's the harm if my horse cribs? Like, I don't care if the stall gets warped or my fences get chewed on. Okay. It's not just about your property, okay? And actually, I would say that's probably the least important thing in this whole picture, in this whole scenario. I think the horse's health comes first. Absolutely. The biggest problem with horses that crib is the excessive wear on the incisors. Your horse absolutely needs to be able to gather up grass, pull up stalks, and chew efficiently, which they cannot do with poor dentition, which cribbing causes. Your horse is more apt to choke, more apt to lose weight, not get enough nutrients, have dull coats, muscle wasting, colic, the list goes on. If your horse has difficulty eating, endless medical problems are possible. Okay, so we just did a lot of doom and gloom, like your horse is cribbing and what you're doing is wrong. So you might be like, Adri, okay, fine, no cribbing collar. What the heck am I supposed to do? Here are some actionable steps. Number one, the best way to get your horse to stop cribbing is to increase turnout as much as possible. For some horses, this might mean taking your horse from being stalled at all to having them in a pasture 24/7. Because confinement is usually the issue. It's usually what's triggering this whole cribbing situation in the first place. So if you remove the confinement, there you go. Now I know that's not practical or possible for everybody. Some horses have to be stalled for various reasons. Maybe you physically don't have a pasture to turn them out into. Maybe they're getting severely bullied out in the pasture and that's a stressful environment for them. If that's not possible, there's small hole hay nets that you can put in your horse's stall so they have 24/7 access to forage. The buildup of stomach acid from not having access to forage, that's another major trigger of cribbing. Reducing high starch grain is another action you can take because horses are not designed to digest high starch grain. It's really difficult for them to do. Their stomach acid ramps up, and again, gastric discomfort can trigger cribbing. I would recommend social interaction for your horse. I get that some horses, they just don't get along with other horses, whether it's the horse that's cribbing's fault or some other horse at the barn's fault. Like horses are horses. How can you be like, oh, it's your fault? Like, whatever, they're horses. But you know what I'm saying. Increasing social interaction, maybe that means you will have to switch barns if your horse's only option for a herd is incompatible dynamic. Maybe wherever you board your horse, there's solid walls of wood so the horses can't see each other. Maybe you're in a shed row where the horses can't see across the aisle to look at another horse either. Maybe there's no windows in the stall. Social interaction is absolutely vital for horses. It is not fair to keep them isolated, and isolation is another major trigger of cribbing. So if you can slowly introduce your horse to the herd, you can even try little baby steps where you walk your horse up and down the stalls and just let your horse sniff other horses. Walk your horse in front of other horses' pastures. Just let them look and smell other horses and say hi. Now, please be aware, a lot of horses will squeal. They might even kick out with their front legs. They might be dramatic, kick out with their hind feet, so, do so safely. But you have a social animal on your hands. It's not fair to keep them in social isolation unless there's some extreme extenuating circumstance. I would also recommend having your vet out to evaluate your horse for existing ulcers. The only way to positively diagnose ulcers is to do an endoscopy where they take a little camera and they put it down your horse's esophagus. They look inside the stomach lining and they see if there's ulcers, which are unhealing wounds. I made a video on ulcers. If you want a little more of a deep dive on gastric ulcers in horses, I'll be sure to put that link in the description as well. And I'll put a card up in this video if you want to check that out. Back to the video. Your horse may have ulcers just because they're a sensitive horse and the feed that they're on isn't suitable for them. Maybe instead of a cribbing collar, it could be something like omeprazole, something to treat the issue at hand. You never know if your horse has ulcers or not, and that can be a big contributing factor. Another way to cut back on cribbing behaviors is to enrich your horse's environment. Whether that means toys, there's jolly balls. They make big inflatable balls that you can put in your horse's pasture. There's stall toys that hang down from the beams and your horse can play. You can have little treat holders where you put like little carrots in a ball and they're preoccupied trying to get the treats out of the ball. There's little rollers that are scented, little toys that make noise. You can try putting a radio in your horse's stall. All these things are ways you can enrich your horse's environment. Maybe grooming your horse, just petting your horse, hanging out, talking to them. These are all ways you can enrich your horse's environment without having to do anything super drastic. A lot of times, the solution is as easy as that, changing their environment. So you may never eliminate cribbing entirely, but there are many things you can do to significantly reduce its prevalence. And the goal isn't to stop the behavior because it's extremely hard to stop a horse from cribbing entirely once they've picked up the habit. The goal is really to just enrich their life so much and give them the best quality of life that you can so that they don't need to crib as much. I don't think if your horse cribs, you're a bad horse owner. I don't think you're in a terrible barn if your horse cribs. But I think there are things you can do that might not have been presented to you. So that's what I'm doing today. If you have a cribber, I want to know, how did it start? What management changes have you tried? Drop it in the comments below. I love chatting with horse owners. I think we get a bad rap sometimes, but I think we're very interesting people. I think every time I have a conversation with a horse owner or an equestrian, I just learn so much. Our community is obsessed with improving our horses' lives, being a better rider, looking at the new studies, and doing things in a different way, all in the pursuit of improvement and progression. You know how it's so hard to determine what your horse should be eating because there's a lot of nuance online, there's a lot of contradicting information in even textbooks, talking from one horse owner to the other. So, to quiet all the noise, I devised a no guess horse feeding guide. It consists of 4 flowcharts because I love flowcharts. It's a fun way to arrive at an answer. Just answer the questions in the flowchart, follow the prompts, and it will give you a recommendation at the very end what you might want to consider feeding your horse. It also comes with a guide to feeding hay and a guide to feeding grain. So if you're interested, go ahead and check that out. I'll put a link in the description, and the link is also in my bio. Thanks very much. I hope you have a good rest of your day and happy feeding.